Welcome everybody to three classic and historic Australian wine regions. And there's a bit of interesting history, and of course, I think the wines are particularly interesting as well. And we have Ken, is that your dog? we have a Hunter Valley Semillon, a Coonawarra Cabernet, and a Barossa Valley Shiraz, and I've got them in that order, so that's how we'll try them. And so to the Hunter Valley Semillon, the Hunter Valley district, as I'm sure everybody knows, it's an hour or so's drive just out of Sydney, and to the north and to the west, and it's there by virtue of the history of the original colony of Sydney, and when the first fleet did arrive, they bought cuttings, and they did in fact plant vines on the shores of what was to become Sydney Harbour, and those vines wouldn't have lasted because of the salt. But they did also plant at Camden, which is sort of out in the western plains of Sydney. And to this day, there are some historic vines there, but they've always struggled a bit. But it wasn't long. So if you look at that settlement in 1788, by the 1920s, the Hunter River had been discovered, and the boats were exploring the Hunter River. And there was also, not only was there the pastures and the agriculture of the Hunter River, but there was also the coal mining, which was recognised pretty early on. So the Hunter Valley started to be developed from the 1820s onwards. And the thing that was noticed about the Hunter Valley was that in the height of summer, particularly around that January, February part, that compared to Sydney and the Sydney Plains, the Hunter Valley was a bit cooler because of the breeze that blew up the Hunter River all through that rather hot part of the year. And at that time, the settlers hadn't worked out how to cross the Blue Mountains. So the mountains to the west of Sydney were effectively a barrier. And in the exploration that was taking place in that sort of narrow coastal plain around Sydney, it was the Hunter Valley that was recognised as being a very pleasant and cool place, particularly in summer. And of course, it so happened there were soil types there that allowed vines to be planted. So some quite big vineyards wound up being planted by the late 1820s. And there's a father figure of Australian wine called James Busby, who brought lots of cuttings into Australia, and he provisioned in France and Spain and then South Africa on his way to Australia. And he bought lots of different cuttings, and he established a huge, big experimental vineyard with all these cuttings at Gresford, which is sort of near Singleton in the Hunter Valley. And it was pretty successful. And from there, cuttings were taken from those vineyards and then used in lots of other places around Australia to establish vineyards. And what was planted at Gresford wound up being the, if you like, seed varieties for the Australian wine industry for a long time. And so that was the upper Hunter Valley, if you like. They certainly noticed that in both the sandy and the red loam soils, that Semillon was pretty successful. Now, Semillon is a variety from Bordeaux in France, famous for Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot for reds, but white wine in Bordeaux, both the dry style and also the dessert style, namely the Sauternes and Barsac, both the dry and the dessert styles are both made of a blend of Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. And so Semillon is a variety that hails from the Bordeaux region, and it would have been seen as a fairly significant variety back in the time when the provisioning was taking place and the Hunter Valley was being established. And Semillon certainly grew well. And to this day, it's a very distinctive, pioneering white wine of the Hunter Valley. And certainly in terms of the world of wine, if you're looking for very distinctive varieties that represent Australia, which are now giving Australia a unique style, Hunter Valley Semillon is one of the very first wines that you think of, because even though there's Semillon grown in Bordeaux, and it's usually blended with Sauvignon Blanc, and yes, Ken, to make Sauterne and Barsac, there's a little bit of Muscatel, which is used as well, but certainly the dry style of Semillon Sauvignon Blanc from Bordeaux is quite a full-bodied, complex style. Normally it's aged in oak barrels, and it gives a very rich style white wine, not dissimilar to larger Chardonnays. Now, in the Hunter Valley, the style of Semillon that's emerged has been quite a delicate, unoaked, very lemony style. So to this first wine, if you stick your nose in it, it does very much smell of very sweet, ripe lemons, and the lemons have been squeezed. So you get this very fresh, sweet lemon juice aroma. Usually when Semillons are young, they give that lemon juice. Now, if you see Italian white wines that give you the lemon pith and the lemon skin, there's a sort of a sour aroma on those wines because of the different varieties, so particularly Fiano. Having said that, some pretty ripe Fiano can be mistaken for some of the greener picked Semillon, and there is a bit of a crossover. And the acknowledged very closest wines to Hunter Valley Semillon would be Italian whites, particularly Soave and Fiano, and some of the others are very similar indeed to Hunter Valley Semillon. But good Hunter Valley Semillon has a particular purity, whereas Italian whites have a bit of mid-palate texture, which gives a bit of interest, particularly with food and particularly as a drink on its own. Hunter Valley Semillon's got this purity about it, not unlike Riesling. And there's the texture of the Semillon is a very fresh, incredibly fresh, clean sort of palate feel. And when you taste that particular Semillon, it's got quite firm acidity, but it's got some softness about it. And it's a very clean, fresh style. And the palate texture you get on an Italian white variety is not there. This is just a very clean, light, fresh, lemony flavour. Now, the Hunter Valley does get pretty hot in February and certainly into March. And so to keep that freshness, most Hunter Valley Semillons, the grapes are picked pretty young. So one of the tricks in the Hunter Valley is to get the ripeness there of the flavour of the Semillon, but where it hasn't got too much sugar content. And that's why when you look up on the bottles, you'll see that the alcohol content's quite low. So this particular one tonight, the Meerea Park, is 11%. So these were picked at 11 Beaumet. So that's of the alcohol strength that you see on a lot of German Rieslings these days. I mean, German Riesling can be lower than that, but with the warmer climates, warmer vintages we've been having for much of this last decade, a lot of German Riesling now is in the 10 and 11 and actually 12% levels. So one of the things about Hunter Valley Semillons, their low alcohol, their freshness, their purity, with a little bit of age, and they do age pretty well, that very fresh, pure Semillon lemony aroma tends to give way to a more complex sort of lemon pudding, and then you start to get a touch of walnut. You start to get a slight nutty walnut character starts to appear. And that happens when Hunter Semillons get to about 3, 4, 5 years of bottle age, I suppose. And because they can age for long periods. This one is a very soft style, and there are different champions of different styles in the Hunter Valley. But the Tyrrell style is a style of Semillon that has a much firmer acidity than this, and the wine is protected from the air very rigorously during winemaking, and the wine's bottled with preservative, sulfur dioxide, with screw caps. And so Hunter Semillons have got a very firm, much firmer acidity than this wine, and they are very slow to age. So Hunter Semillons, there are all these stories about someone trying 20 and 25 and 30-year-old Tyrrell's Semillon, and they look like they're only 3 or 4 or 5 years old. And it's just something, the way that that Tyrrells just like to make the wine. Tyrrells have got quite a number of Semillons, and you can go looking for those. I mean, their granddad one, which is quite hard to find, is a wine called Vat 1. But they have Stevens Semillon and Johnno's, and then there's the Tyrrell's Estate Semillons, and you can find those readily enough around the place, and they're not that expensive.
Andrew, we're drinking the Brookdale Road from Tyrrell's tonight, which is a 2017. It's very soft.
Yeah, well, that's nice. That's good. It's probably one of the ones. Was that a cellar door, or did you get that at Dan Murphy or somewhere?
But at Dan Murphy's.
Yeah, Dan's. Yeah, I think that's one of the. It's a fairly affordable wine too, isn't it, Brooke? Yeah, that's good.
$20 a drop.
Yeah, they still age well. It's a bit like, so the other famous producer in the Hunter Valley is Mount Pleasant, that is McWilliams. And Mount Pleasant deliberately ferment the Semillon on its skins, on the grape skins overnight, with a bit of air. And so there's a slightly broader texture on Mount Pleasant Semillons. And they age with they keep their freshness, but they get a nuttiness on them more readily than Tyrrell's does. And they also make some fabulous wines. Lovedale's their famous one. But they've got a very affordable Semillon called Elizabeth, McWilliams Mount Pleasant Elizabeth Semillon, which is about $18, $19, but often on special, and you can get it cheaper than that. And it ages remarkably well, and it actually can repay really well, about 5, 6, 7, up to 10 years of aging for such an inexpensive wine. I mean, if you're buying a dozen of that and you wait till it's on special, you can probably get Mount Pleasant Elizabeth Semillon, the current release. You'd be able to buy that for about $15 a bottle or thereabouts, I would have thought. And putting that away for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years and getting yourself a, beautifully aged white wine is really good to do. And it's such an inexpensive wine to do it with. So I've been very pleasantly surprised, because I've got bits and pieces of Elizabeth going back various years, and they've all been good when you open them, which is really nice. So Hunter Valley Semillon's got that role. I find, though, that with general consumers, that most Australians, unless you're Sydney-siders, don't know much about Hunter Valley Semillon and don't really care much about it particularly. It's I haven't seen the statistics now for a few years, but the vast majority of Hunter Valley Semillon is either sold from the cellar door or sold in the Sydney market. And then what's not sold in the cellar door and Sydney market goes to country New South Wales and Queensland. So Queensland has a soft spot for it, although it's still a fairly small part of the market. But the other states of Australia, you cannot find Hunter Valley Semillon. It's not in the shops. It's not on restaurant wine lists. No one knows about it. And when you serve Hunter Valley Semillon, one of the things about it is it's very lemony and it's pretty dry. And so it tends to be a wine that appeals to more mature drinkers, and people who are just starting out looking at wine regard Hunter Valley Semillon as, well, they call it sour. If you've got high acidity and it's dry, there's a certain sourness, which is not very friendly for a lot of consumers. But just like with Rieslings, which also have that same sour acidity, I suppose, the freshness and the purity make the wine fantastic for being served chilled, on hot days with fresh light foods. It's just one of the most wonderful wines. And then if you get it at 3, 4, 5 years of bottle age, the wine just fills out a little and is just utterly delicious. In London, when I was doing wine tastings and visiting quite a bit, if there was ever an array of Australian wines and Masters of Wine were putting on an array of wines with Australian wine, they'd always have Hunter Semillon. And when you explain what I just explained, namely that most Hunter Semillons are sold and consumed in, the Hunter Valley or in the Sydney market, they're quite surprised because they think that this Hunter Valley Semillon is such a wonderful wine and it's inexpensive, and they can't see why Australians wouldn't be embracing the wine all over the country. But that's not what happens. But it's regarded as a great classic, and it's been around since it would have been first planted in the late 1820s, 1828 to be precise. And from the 1830s onwards, we've had Hunter Valley Semillon, and it's a really famous example. So it's number one of our very classic Australian wines for tonight. Just before we finish talking about the Hunter Valley, the other classic wine of the Hunter Valley is Shiraz, which we'll leave for another time. We've had Hunter Valley Shiraz before in these tastings, and I really like Hunter Valley Shiraz as well. But tonight we have the Semillon as our classic wine. So how did you find it? Any questions? Anybody? It's probably, Frederick, it's probably a newer one to you, Hunter Valley Semillon, because it's quite different to Bordeaux, obviously. But how do you find this? It's got its own character.
Yes, it's a very Well, we didn't know it, and we were just talking that we probably tasted it in the first week we arrived in Sydney, and we were not ready for it. We couldn't sort of bring it home, but now it's a very sort of a pleasant discovery, and I really like it. And I was surprised by hearing you say that in the rest of Australia it's not really known or appreciated, because that could have a broad audience, I think. But
I think it's the that perceived sour acidity thing that a lot of consumers don't like that much. There's a bit of Semillon in Western Australia, in Margaret River, where they normally blend it with Sauvignon Blanc. And then there's also Semillon in South Australia, and not much left now, but there's bits of it left in mainly Clare Valley. And in South Australia, Semillon was blended with other white varieties, and up until the laws changed in the 1990s, the blended Semillon from South Australia was known as white Burgundy, and it was blended, and it was and it sort of gave the variety a bit of a bad name, really, because it was considered to be one of those high volume mass produced wines. But anyway, it's interesting. I think Laura's not there. I was going to ask Laura and the gang how they find Semillon, but Lana, are you there? You got your microphone? I'm just interested how the younger consumers enjoy Semillon. You got the Semillon there in front of you? No. Yeah, nodding head. Very good. Yeah, excellent. Okay.
Sorry.
How do you find it?
Yeah, I think we've all really enjoyed it. Yeah. I've enjoyed the few sips that I'm allowed, and Steph's really liked it.
Yeah, I really like it. It's light. I love the lemony.
Yeah. You don't find there's that sour acidity thing going on that would be off-putting? I mean, a lot of people are always a little bit wary of that.
No, I don't find that at all.
Okay.
Although I have had other Semillons that I haven't liked, but I really liked this one.
Yeah, that's good. No, I think it's good. Certainly, if you get some Semillon, can be a little bit of one of the varieties that overcrops easily, and then you can get some watery Semillons. And watery Semillon can often be quite acidic and tart, and not have that much lemony flavour. So this one's got quite a bit of lemony flavour, I guess, which is what makes it interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. We also had it not as cold to begin with, and then we got it down a little bit, and it was much. Really different.
Very good. Okay, well, we might move along to Coonawarra Cabernet, and this is Coonawarra Cabernet is one of my favourite regions, and at the moment Coonawarra is a bit, what's the word, out of fashion. in Australia. Again, if you go to an Australian tasting in the UK, along with Hunter Valley Semillon, there'd always be a Coonawarra red and a Margaret River red probably, and a Barossa Shiraz. That's what the international wine trade would consider to be Australia's classic wines. But in Australia itself, that's not necessarily the case. With Cabernet Sauvignon, it's got a checkered image. Cabernet Sauvignon, seen as a full-bodied red, very old-fashioned, the sort of wine that Dad drinks, and therefore, in terms of emerging varieties and trendy wine bars and bistros and sommeliers, they're not interested in Cabernet Sauvignon particularly. If you were going to have a Cabernet Sauvignon, Margaret River tends to steal all of the thunder, and Margaret River itself has producers that are, if you like, rediscovering Cabernet. And Cullen's these days is biodynamic, for example, and very much champions the biodynamic natural style of making Margaret River Cabernet Sauvignon, which is one way you can actually bring a Cabernet in front of the trendy sommeliers and so on. Coonawarra just doesn't seem to be able to do all that, and Coonawarra is being left behind somewhat in the trend stakes. But I think it's always been a fabulous region. It's had some setbacks in its history. So when the pioneers came to Adelaide, and famously Adelaide was settled as a free settlement with no convicts, and they fanned out from Adelaide pretty quickly, and the English settlers were moved first, and they got to the Barossa Valley and north of Adelaide, and I'll come back to that when we get to Wine 3. But they moved down through the southeast of South Australia, which is very flat country. This is across towards the Victorian border. You get the cold winds off the Southern Ocean, so it's cold and flat, but it does rain, and so there are lots of pastures. And so the southern eastern part of South Australia became very quickly famous for sheep. And so the district of Coonawarra, which is about a 4 or 5 hour drive from Adelaide, it's quite a long way. It was settled by English pastoralists for sheep, and it was a big sheep area. And that all happened by about the 1840s, about 1850, give or take. So that's when the area first came about. Now, the history was that the road in that flat land that had a lot of rain, the roads had to follow the small ridges and the harder bits of ground, because otherwise all the bullock drays and transport all became bogged, obviously. So the little township of Penola, the explorers soon realised that there was quite a good roadway, and it turned out that there was a ridge that was ever so slightly higher than all the surrounding black soil. And this ridge was a ridge of chalk and limestone, and it was slightly above, and it was hard when it rained. And so that's where the road went. By the 1850s, some of the sheep farmers had realised, though, that if you because this quite long ridge of limestone, it drained well, and that meant you could plant crops on it. Particularly, you could plant fruit trees, which wouldn't grow well out on the black soil because the drainage wasn't good enough and the water wouldn't get away, and so the fruit trees would get the wet roots, which makes them rot. And of course, the other thing then was, of course, it wasn't long before they started growing grapes. So the original sort of vast owner of all of the land there, which was John Riddoch, then subdivided this long, narrow strip of limestone, and offered small blocks of land for other people to come and buy and plant fruit trees and so on. And it became known as the Panola Fruit Colony. But of course, a lot of them planted grapes. And the people who planted grapes and planted fruit trees and so on, because they bought these blocks, they were known as blockers, which is a term that's still around to this day. People who bought a block of good soil, grew grapes, and probably sold the grapes and the produce off, although a lot of them started making wine with it as well. And John Riddoch himself kept parts of it and established vines, and of course that historic property became what's now Wynn's Coonawarra estate. To now is where that came about. But the vines went pretty well, and Cabernet Sauvignon and Reds and other whites were planted there and succeeded particularly well. And I guess the classic, there's Shiraz as well, which is quite well known, but the classic wine from Coonawarra by the 1850s, 60s, 70s was Cabernet Sauvignon. And by the 1880s, Coonawarra Cabernet, and it was named Claret and all those old-fashioned names, but the wine was being sent off to England, where it was winning prizes. It was going to wine competitions in France and winning prizes, and the wine was considered a very great district and a great wine. In 1890s, there was a very famous bank bust and depression in Australia, but all over the world actually, and a lot of wine producers in Coonawarra closed down, and they didn't really reopen until wine took off again in Australia in the 1980s. There were the hardy old pioneers that kept going, so Wynn's Coonawarra and Brands and some of the original old producers. But it was a sort of a sad history in many ways. So one of the things that's occurred with Coonawarra is that there were quite a lot of vineyards there with a lot of very old vines dating back to the 1850s to the 1880s. And it's quite a big area. The thing about Coonawarra is it's pretty cold, it's bleak, being a cold area, it produces cool climate Cabernet Sauvignon, and you tend to find the Cabernet of Coonawarra very aromatic. So when you stick your nose in this one, if you've got the same one as me, Coonawarra usually has a very lifted blackcurrant liqueur aroma. And often if they're very, very intense, they almost go to that Ribena aroma, that slightly green blackcurrant cordial stuff that you can mix up. And this one here, this Coonawarra Cabernet, we've got the one from the Wine Experience. This has got that aroma. When you stick your nose in that, there's a touch of also another thing you see on Coonawarra Cabernet is a dark olive aroma, black olive and blackcurrant aroma. And they can often be very aromatic and very pretty. They can often have a lovely lifted blackcurrant aroma on them. Some of the producers there use quite a lot of oak, and the wines can be very, very similar to Saint-Julien, which is the soft, rich, fruity commune in Bordeaux, which is very famous Cabernet Sauvignon commune. Compared to, say, the Cabernets of Margaret River, Coonawarra Cabernets tend to be a little softer on the palate and more aromatic and more blackcurranty, whereas Margaret River Cabernets have a darker fruit, and Margaret River Cabernets have a very, like the black tea leaf, when you're putting the spoonful of tea leaf into the teapot to make tea the old-fashioned way, you get a whiff of a very dark tea leaf aroma. And Margaret River tends to have that, and Margaret River Cabernet tends to be more powerful, more alcoholic, more oak, whereas Coonawarra Cabernets are elegant, lighter-bodied, lower alcohols, more aromatic. They have Coonawarra Cabernet has higher acidity, and which again can give you that slightly Italian sort of, I wouldn't say sour, but there's a slightly savoury feel to the wine. But that means that Coonawarra Cabernets age really well. And there's lots of stories of Coonawarra Cabernets, you know, coming out from 20 and 30 and 40 years of age and being put on tables around the world with the best of Bordeaux and holding their own very, very well. And there's lots of famous stories. So some of Australia's most famous names, so Mildara, Lindemans, Petaluma, Wynns Coonawarra, and so on, all really got their start and their fame with Coonawarra Cabernets. When Margaret River came along, and with some of the trends in wine, Coonawarra has suffered a bit with its image. One of the other issues that occurred is that particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, and I guess into the 1990s, when Australian wine was going quite well, because of the remoteness of Coonawarra, getting agricultural labourers has always been a problem. So Coonawarra being flat, a lot of the pruning was done by machines and the harvesting was done by machines. And one of the things about machine harvesting is machine harvesting doesn't select the different canes to cut and prune when you're doing the winter pruning. What happens with machine pruning is that the pruners are the big discs just go along and cut the tops of where all the shoots are sticking up, all the canes are sticking up. And it's called hedging is the expression. So they're not discriminating, they just cut everything that sticks up. And so to get a crop, this system came along that was called hedging and minimal, and then it was hedging followed by minimal pruning. Now, minimal pruning is where there's no control later on when after spring, when all the leaves grow. And so what tended to happen in Coonawarra for a while there was that there'd be this very heavy hedging followed by this minimal pruning regime, and all the canes grew with lots of leaves and they shaded the bunches of berries that were growing underneath. And if you have shade, the berries don't ripen properly. And you can get the sugar accumulation, but the flavour accumulation can be green. And there's in fact a substance that forms in the berries called dimethyl sulfide, which is known far and wide as DMS. And DMS red grapes give you a cough mixture mulberry aroma. With that green Irish moss, green herb cough mixture smell. And you still see it a little around. Coonawarra has pretty much found the labourers and they've gone back and repruned a lot of the vineyards. But a lot of people had memories of Coonawarra wines in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s with these DMS green aromas on them. And it's not that nice. You get alcohol and ripeness of taste, but you've got this green aroma. So it's like having, for the jokes all go with the Adelaideans, it's like having the Adelaide floater, which is the meat pie with the peas stuffed in it. So you get the rich meat taste, but the smell of the peas. So the other name in the wine shows for the DMS aroma, when you find it, is called pie and peas. So judges stick their nose in a glass of wine and say, oh, pie and peas. That must be Coonawarra Cabernet. And unfortunately, it gave Coonawarra a bad name. The era is pretty much behind us. There's still a couple of producers that are struggling, but mostly Coonawarra producers have left that era behind, but it left a bad name. And Coonawarra's battled that quite a bit. But you know, the producers that got in early and sorted all that sort of stuff out and made very elegant wines, I think the wines are great. A really good one these days is, it's a bit ubiquitous, but Wynns Coonawarra Black Label. The current releases of that are delightful. They're elegant, not too much oak, nicely balanced, not a trace of that DMS character, but they're quite light, and there's a very elegant black curranty aroma on them. They're not as cedary as Saint Julien or Margaux in Bordeaux because the oak's been held back, but the wines are very nice. And you can get Black Label on special. And if you don't want to go all the way to Black Label, you can get the Cabernet Shiraz with the red stripe, which is, you know, pretty good. And then there are some other lesser Coonawarra Cabernet labels from Wings that are slightly lower prices. So they're worth a look. But, you know, there are lots of other producers around that do Coonawarra Cabernet, and you know, you get an array of pretty good pricing if you go looking for it. Because bearing in mind, the Coonawarra is quite a sizable area, so there's quite a lot of wine, and it doesn't sell that readily. So a lot of Coonawarra wine is discounted, and so if you go sniffing, you'll find Coonawarra. Particularly, I'd go after Coonawarra Cabernet mainly, but if you want to have a look at Coonawarra Shiraz too, that's a bit of fun. But Coonawarra Cabernet, you can go exploring really, really well and have a lot of fun.
Can I give a double thumbs up to Parker?
Yeah, Parker Estate's a good one. Yep. Parker Estate's got some of the old Rougon vineyards, and because there's been a lot of changes of ownership in Coonawarra over the years, but it's a good one. The old families that are there as well, that are still there.
Redmond.
Yeah. Redmond's a good one. Redmond's often quite a reasonable price too.
Yeah, I remember going there a couple of years ago, Andrew, and it was like stepping back into about 1973. They hadn't touched their cellar door, like it was just a weird experience. But, you know, the Redmond boys were there serving on this counter. It was amazing.
Going to Coonawarra as a visitor is wonderful because it's so isolated and they don't get many tourists. And they all have their little cellar doors, and they just love it for people who come in who've got wine knowledge and want to have a look. You know, they're normally all over you.
There was the experience we had. We stayed at Yalumba. So the Yalumba had that fantastic thing called the cigar, which is like the shape of the Coonawarra, Cab Sav, and we could walk to about 8 or 9 wineries just through the vines. It was just probably illegal, but it was just a lovely thing to do, you know, in the middle of winter. Unbelievable.
Yeah, no, that sounds lovely. I think that'd be a marvellous way to do things. I've only ever been the one time to Coonawarra, and yeah, I'd like to go back. It's not the easiest place to get to, as I've been discussing. So hopefully you can see the elegance and that light black curranty aroma. If we now move to the Barossa Shiraz, you'll see the contrast. So Barossa is quite a hot region. That is the floor of the Barossa Valley. If you want to have a more elegant, cooler climate wine, the Barossa producers started going up into the Eden Valley and the Barossa Hills, and the Eden Valley itself, particularly around, you know, the Pusey Vale bit, that's up at about 550, 600 meters. Now that's a fair way up. That's pretty high. So and in such a short distance from the floor of the Barossa, it's quite a contrast to go from quite a hot part of the Barossa up to Eden Valley. But with the Barossa Valley, it had the deep alluvial loams and soils. It was the early explorers just coming north from Adelaide. They were pretty canny at recognising ground, and they saw the sheep pasture areas, which is what still so much in South Australia. There were the wheat growing bits, but when you had water and these alluvial soils and loams, they realised you could plant crops there. And of course, it wasn't long before they planted vines. Now, the first settlers were there were the English, so the Smiths and the Angus, and gave their names to the various places. And then the German and Polish immigrants followed soon after. So Johann Gramp planted grapes pretty quickly at Jacobs Creek in the and that was 1850s, and so 1840s, sorry. And so the area was pretty successful pretty much straight away. And lots of families came and settled there and had a mixture of crops. So there were, fruit trees and sheep and, of course, the vines. And just like with Coonawarra, Australian wine boomed from the 1840s and 50s through to the bust in 1890. And the thing about the Barossa Valley was that it was able to make high-strength reds, and they could send them to England in barrels, and they were sold as high-strength, normally with some allusion to the Empire. So, Empire Red or whatever, they had various names, and they were very popular because they were very alcoholic and very big. And until the 1890s, it was a wonderful time, and a lot of wineries got established and made a lot of money. Once the bust occurred, only the very hardy ones stayed on, and so those families became quite famous. So the Smiths to this day still own Yalumba. They're up at Angaston, and the other families. So the Gramps really only sold out the Orlando business in the late 1970s, really, and the other families that were sort of involved, there were quite a few. So bearing in mind then that the Barossa Valley is quite a warm place, and Shiraz does exceedingly well. When you try this Michael Hall Shiraz, as soon as you stick your nose in that, you can smell this quite powerful liqueur, raspberry, strong red fruits aroma, blueberries, pate. There's a really rich aroma, and to taste it, it's got quite a big viscosity, and that savoury acidity that we saw on Coonawarra is not present at all. This has got a big, juicy, viscous, and slightly hot feel. It's quite an elegant Shiraz. It's rounded and soft, but as you swallow a mouthful, you can taste a little degree of warmth and hotness, particularly after you've swallowed a mouthful and you're sort of looking for that persistence at the back of your throat. There's that warmth, like someone sort of put maybe a tablespoon of vodka into your wine. You get a little warmth of the spirit. It's not spirituous, it's not faulty from that, but there's a warmth there from the considerable alcohol level. And I must have a look and see what the alcohol is. But that's usually one of the big factors about Barossa Valley, particularly Barossa Valley Shiraz. It's 14.5%. So you're allowed 0.5% leeway. So that wine might even be 15%, but when they measured it was 14.5. So that's pretty high in alcohol for a table wine under anybody's method of measurement, and it tastes it. It's big, full-bodied. It's very much a winter warmer with quite powerful foods. It's a big, flavoursome red, and that very powerful raspberry, blueberries, viscous, rich style Shiraz is very much a Barossa hallmark. This one here has not that much oak. There's a little, and so you get a touch of the little touch of the oakiness. Some of the Barossa producers put quite a lot of oak barrel flavour on them, and Penfolds and Wolf Blasts are ubiquitous for having quite a strong oakiness in the wines. And that's a style that traditionally has been pretty famous in Australia. A lot of people love it. There's certainly, as we've discussed in previous Zoom tastings, there's a movement in the Barossa Valley, mainly from younger winemakers, to rebel against that and to get the Barossa Shiraz to a very high level of intensity, but to pick it a little younger when it's slightly spicy, and not to have such high alcohol and not to have as much oak on it. And so you get these different movements of making Shiraz in the Barossa Valley. The Barossa Valley is a very big region, so there's room for lots of different styles and lots of different wine producers. I guess in the UK, if you went to, the average English or British consumer and said, you know about Australian wine, what is your most recollected Australian wine? They'd be saying Shiraz, and they'd probably say Barossa Shiraz. It's the biggest, most famous, most distinctive, most well-known for that big, generous style. You can get that at reasonably inexpensive prices, so it's no wonder it's very, very successful. And that's our third classic wine tonight. So how do you find them? What do you think? Amy, did you enjoy the Coonawarra and the Barossa Shiraz?
Yeah, for me, I think the Coonawarra, I've never been a big fan of very sort of bold tannin reds. So for me, I definitely prefer the Shiraz over the Cab Sav. And then the Semillon was very nice. Todd and I are quite big fans of Semillon, and it's readily available where we are. So you can buy Semillon pretty much at any bottle shop here. So definitely a big fan of the Semillon, and we have a Broken Wood 2018 Semillon that we're going to serve at our wedding later this year. So we first tasted that in 2019, I think it was, and we managed to buy up a whole heap so that we could serve it at our wedding, which was postponed longer than what we wanted it to, but hopefully it will have aged quite nicely by November. So
sounds lovely. Sounds lovely. Yes, we don't know what's happening with any of that at the moment. We're waiting to see whether, at the moment, officially the Queensland border's open to New South Wales country areas, but that may change.
We still have 4 months, so let's not jinx it. Right? 4 months. Let's leave it at that.
Well, it's so this morning we actually went for breakfast to Corrigan. So it's about 30 minutes door to door from our house. So we had breakfast in Corrigan this morning and went to Peterson's, had some nice sparkling with breakfast, and we actually went past Meerea Park cellar door. They were closed this morning because people from Sydney, sorry, Frederick and Hannah, aren't allowed up our way. The area is very quiet.
It's very quiet.
So a lot of cellar doors have reduced their hours because their big market is, busloads of people from Sydney. But look, Semillon is my thing. Being born in the Hunter Valley, growing up, that's a very zesty, lemony. It's seafood. It's summer. It's have it with prawns. Very beautiful cold. Really like that Semillon today.
Yeah, lovely, very good. And Ken, what's your take on from the English wine trade? What do you think of with Coonawarra Cabernet versus Barossa Shiraz?
Personally, and I guess because of our location, we tend not to drink much Shiraz. I'd have embarrassingly little Shiraz in the cellar, but we do keep a bit of a stock of Coonawarra Cabernet. And you mentioned the Wynn's Black Label. The 2015 Wynn's Black Label was the last one I added to the cellar, and I got the 2015 vintage for $30. Thank you very much indeed. I'll have that.
Mm-hmm.
Can't go wrong there, can you?
No, well, that's a good price. That's a very good price. Lovely wine too.
I'd be very interested in your comment on this. I actually drank it side by side with a 2004 Chateau Mille Rose. Sorry, 2005 Chateau Mille Rose. Now, where's Chateau Mille Rose? It's Bordeaux, but where? I've forgotten.
Yeah, it's Cru Bourgeois, and it's tucked in behind Saint Julien, so it's in the softer, juicy bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what struck me, and what frequently strikes me with my palate, is I find the tannins, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, on the right-hand side of my screen in the cream-coloured top. You were saying about the tannins, that you didn't like red wine tannins. And I find the French tannins more aggressive and sour than the tannins of the Coonawarra wines. And I much prefer the Coonawarra wines because of that, as well as the qualities you described a few minutes ago. So yes, I have a strong preference for Coonawarra and Margaret River over France, simply because so many of the French ones, the tannins just seem to grate on my palate.
I think one of the things to remember is that, well, yes, the French traditional production would be more tannic than Australia, more extraction and so on. And if you have a colder year or just a cold climate, just anyway, a slight higher content of acidity reinforces tannin. So let's supposing you've got, you know, a middling amount of tannin, and then in a cold year you have a little more acidity, the tannin jumps up and you see it very, very suddenly. Now, with Bordeaux since 2014, they've had the opposite issue because they've had such lovely ripe years that they're actually low on acidity. So that in fact, a lot of Bordeaux's moved to these early aging, very plump wines, which is what everybody's been seeing since 2014 vintage. But that's not normal. Well, it might be the new normal, who knows? But certainly the traditional Bordeaux was geared for a lot of extraction and for a firm acidity, but not too much. But when you had a green year, of course, the acidity jumped up, and therefore the tannin, apparent tannin, as well. So when Amy said a moment ago that she can see tannin on the Coonawarra, because the Coonawarra's got quite a bit of acidity on it, whereas the Barossa Valley Shiraz has got very little. So that means that there's probably equal amounts of tannin in the Shiraz and from the Barossa and the Cabernet from Coonawarra. But of course, the Coonawarra's got a degree of acidity which is bringing out the tannin. You see it a lot more, so you get that, you know, back of the palate, firm grippiness, and that slightly savoury overall palate feel, and that will be the acidity doing that. So,
right.
Which of course is what happens in Bordeaux. Well, traditionally, what happened in Bordeaux, not in recent years.
I think I remember you commenting on this before, and if I recall correctly, you made the comment that if they're tannic when they're young, and I'm thinking of the French one, they're still going to be tannic when they're older. And certainly I've had that wine in the cellar for damn near 15 years now, and it seems to me just as tannic now as it was when I first tried it in 2008 or whatever it was.
Yeah. Well, tannin will polymerize a bit.
Yeah, there's a little bit of filmy tannin in the bottle, but not.
The problem is that the time you need for tannins to soften is quite a long time. And by the time the tannins have softened, normally the fruit has changed or disappeared.
Yes, yes.
And of course, fruitiness is a great thing for, you know, softening and
yep, I agree.
The wine together. So if the fruit dries out, you know, and you're still waiting for the tannins to soften, then usually you've lost it by then.
And also, I think I'm correct in saying, aren't I, Andrew, that of the different elements in the wine, one of the ones that's present at the highest concentrations of what, a couple of 100 milligrams per litre is tannin.
Yeah, yeah.
So a tiny bit of filmy tannin on the bottle is not the tannin softening and reducing. It's 1% of all the tannins in the damn bottle. So it's not going to make any difference.
The big thing is the balance of the components. If you're
yes, exactly, yeah.
If you've got quite a lot of tannin, but you've got quite a lot of fruit as well, that works. And
yes.
You can taste it when the wine's young, and then when the wine's older, those levels are still there. I mean, they've come together and harmonized better. But if the wine's a bit out of balance when it's young, it's not going to come into balance with age. It's you know, it's what it is. And
yep.
You can get
the other thing I wondered was whether, I mean, remember I said once before that we've got something like 20 different bitter receptors. And I just wondered whether there's something about the nature of the tannins produced in Bordeaux wines that's subtly different from the nature of the tannins in the Coonawarra, and that maybe I'm just more sensitive to the French ones, therefore it tastes a little more bitter to me, whereas the Coonawarra ones don't. I don't know. We've got a lot to learn still.
Yeah, I guess so. I think it's back to the same comments about Burgundy and Tasmanian Pinot Noir. I suppose when PhD or postgraduate wine scholars are doing studies of the sort of thing you just mentioned, they measure the various ratios. And it turns out the best bits of Bordeaux or the best bits of Burgundy, the ratio of, the surface area of a grape and the number of bunches and the number of bunches on a length of cane and the sheer colour and intensity when the grapes come into the winery is just incredibly high on the best French districts. Although Napa Valley and Australia are catching up, but just so good. And then the French just tend to be very extractive in the winemaking. They tend to ferment at warmer temperatures with a lot more maceration regimes, because I think the people are prepared to spend a lot of money on expensive wine in France, particularly Bordeaux, do expect to age them and are quite happy to have wines that are very, very aggressive when they're young, whereas in Australia, that's just not the case. And so we just, Australia tends to make wines that are not that aggressive when they're young. But certainly there's a lot of extractive winemaking practices that are pretty normal in France. The big question that, because everybody wants to know, including the French themselves, is with this string of warm vintages across France since 2014, that the traditional winemaking practices shouldn't be followed, because they're getting different wines than what they intend to. And that's one of the really intriguing things. So we'll have to wait and see about that. So yeah, France is traditionally going to have much more tannin than Australia. That's definitely how it is. And in terms of tradition and the receptors to taste it, I mean, tannin is the great mouth cleanser for oily and fatty foods. So if you're having beef and animal meat dishes, the tannins are great accompaniment to it. That's always been the role of tannin. Well, there's some 3 classics from Australia. You could have other regions vying for classic regions, I suppose. A few others that one could mention. Clare Valley would put its hand up for Clare Valley Riesling and Clare Valley Shiraz, I guess. Obviously, there's Margaret River for Cabernet. Adelaide Hills would put its hand up for Chardonnay. Mornington Peninsula would put its hand up for, Pinot Noir as being a kind of a great pioneering area in Australia. The Yarra Valley would put its hand up for Chardonnay. Originally, they put their hand up for Cabernet, and Yarra Valley Cabernets are very pretty. There's no doubt about it. They're a little more fruitier and prettier than Coonawarra, but they don't have the depth of Coonawarra, I don't think. But certainly there's the Yarra Valley would be considered for that. One of the historic areas of Australia, due to the gold rushes, are the wine regions around Great Western and the Grampians through that sort of Ballarat, Bendigo, Avoca area. So you've got Bess Great Western and Seppelt Great Western, and that was very famous for Shiraz. And generally the Shiraz theme continued right through that area. And so now Heathcote is a region which is just east of Bendigo. And Heathcote pops up, I guess, after, well, Heathcote Shiraz would pop up as a classic Australian wine after sort of Barossa Shiraz, Hunter Valley Shiraz, and Great Western. McLaren Vale would poke its hand up there too, I would suspect, on Shiraz, but Heathcote's in the lineup as well, as being considered what would be an Australian classic. And there's certainly been some producers from Heathcote that have been very successful for a long period of time. I mean, Jasper Hill's probably the best known producer there, but there are a lot of producers. So when you start talking about these classic bits of Australia, we certainly have a lot to offer. Soon we'll be saying Tasmanian Pinot as an Australian classic. There's so much Pinot Noir being produced, and it's coming on so fast. But because it's all very young, it's all 20 years old or less, which is just a flutter of an eyelid in the timescale. But anyway, very interesting. So we'll see how we go. Next week we're going to jump to a quite different theme with emerging varieties, and we set the wines up for next week before we knew the results of the Emerging Varieties Challenge, which was held 2 weeks ago, and there were some interesting results. Yalumba Virgilius Viognier was the top white, but there were some interesting wines from Queensland that did well, and the top red wound up being the Granite Belt Alianico, which is some interesting variety. I was just chatting about that earlier on, but we haven't got that in the tasting for next week. We've got some other really interesting wines, but have a look out. We have next week we've got a variety called Meerea, and we have the one from Adelaide Hills Meerea grows in the part of the high plains of northwestern Spain, not far from Tempranillo. And we know that Tempranillo is so successful and going to be really successful in Australia, and I suspect that Meerea is going to be very successful as well. So that's for next week, along with a couple of other interesting emerging varieties. So a bit of a change of pace from tonight's talk of the traditional classic regions, but anyway, something different. So that's what we've got. So we'll look forward to seeing you all next week. How are you coping with lockdown, Frederick? Are you sick of it yet? You must. Everyone's tearing their hair out in Sydney, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a bit like a time machine, right? It's like we're back in time. It's the same like a year ago, but we're just a year older now. And every day feels the same. And so we were very happy with the wine tasting today, because at least that signaled to us it was Sunday. So that's very good.
That's right. They call the days Blur's Day, don't they? All the days just go on to another. Well, that's good. I'm glad we can all meet up and do this sort of thing and taste some interesting wine. It's the only way. Yeah, we're waiting with bated breath to see in Queensland. We don't know. It's been amazing that there hasn't been more outbreak than what's been announced already. But compared to Melbourne and Sydney, we've been lucky in Queensland. We'll wait and see, I suppose. We hope, yeah. Oh, well, survive the lockdown. You've got another week of it to look forward to, or at least. Maybe. We'll have to, maybe we'll do
should do a special COVID virtual tasting just for the...
Yeah, you might have to do the Muse wines, Laura.
Yes.
Yeah, do a special. We'll do it.
We've got the Muse wines in the pack. Maybe we'll do a night number 3 this month.
Maybe a midweek session.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
if the lockdowns keep going, we'll do 3 nights in August, not just 2.
Do a special COVID. Yeah, special COVID.
Yeah, that's right.
So for the Melburnians as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the Melburnians emailed me before and said, "Can we record the session?" because they couldn't join. But yeah, we'll have to do that. So. Yeah,
Well, if our wedding doesn't go ahead, we have bottles upon bottles of wines. We'll just send it out to everyone, and we'll just do like a virtual wedding wine tasting, and then they won't go to waste.
Online wedding, bring it on.
Woo!
Yeah, we've got dozens and dozens of bottles, so don't worry.
Oh, yeah. No, you'll be fine. It's still 4 months away.
Yeah. No, I'm sure it will work out. Yeah, fingers crossed. I mean, the vaccination rate's steadily increasing, so that will make a big difference. All right, gang. Lovely to see everybody on Sunday night. So hang in there if you're in lockdown, and I'll be up at the winery. Unless we get locked down too, I'll be at the winery next Sunday. So I'll.
It's inevitable, Andrew. It's inevitable.
Yeah, well, we'll see. See whether we can.
Asia, love the lockdown.
Yeah. Well, she's gone to Tokyo, so she.
When she comes back from Tokyo, now that State of Origin's done, and then when she comes back from Tokyo, it'll be like, okay, now we can lock
Yeah, I was going to say, not to be too political, but only after the football finishes and after Tokyo finishes will she lock down.
Yeah, when it's convenient.
That might be the case. So at least next Sunday I'll be up at the winery and I can talk to you all from up there. So. Right, good night. Enjoy stuff and enjoy dinner. See you next week.
Not everyone.
Bye.
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 I think you should get a bit out.